Hello everyone, welcome to another video in this full stack Flutter development series. In this video we'll continue to implement our restaurant Cubit, creating the different methods and also testing the states that it is working as we expect it should. It is always good to test things as you go along so that when we finally create our UI and wire up things, then everything will be behaving as it should, without much need for change. So as it stands, we are now in our restaurant Cubit, and we have created and tested our get all restaurant method. And so our next method that we want to create, which is pretty similar to our get restaurant method, our get all restaurant, is our get restaurants by location. This method will have the page, which is the number, and also the location, which will be generated using Google Maps. So again, the first step is to start loading. And after we've loaded the data, rather while loading is happening, we go ahead and say page result. We go ahead and fetch the data using the API. So get restaurants by location. We'll pass in the page. The page size in this case is a private page size, which is set in the constructor, and also the location. And so after we have received the result, we will go ahead and, just like the get all restaurants, it's the same call, since it's basically returning the same thing. So I'll go ahead and call that method to set error if no restaurant is found, or to set the data. After that, I'll go ahead and create the search Cubit. I'm just going to create these methods, then we'll test them. And this allows us to search for restaurants. So I'll accept a page and a query string. And then the principle is the same. Start loading. And after loading, we'll go ahead and we'll say final search results. We'll set that to, we'll use our API, use the find restaurants method. Set our page size, and the search term, in this case the search query. And again, we are just going to go ahead and paste the same thing from above, but instead of page result here, I'm going to change it to search results. So there we have our search method. Go ahead and make this an async method. And after our search, we'll have our get restaurant method. This will accept a string ID and we'll do the same thing. Start loading. Then we will call our API. So we'll say final menu equal to our get menu or get restaurant rather from my API, and there I'll pass in the restaurant ID. Should be restaurant. And then I am going to check. So if the restaurant is not null, then I want to emit a restaurant loaded state. And I'll pass in the restaurant there. Otherwise, I want to emit a error state, and in that error state I want to pass in the message restaurant not found. So that is our get restaurant method. And now for our get restaurant menu, this will accept a restaurant ID and this will basically be the same thing as the get restaurant. So I'm just gonna quickly copy this code here. Just gonna copy it and move it down, and then change restaurant, change this to restaurant ID, change this to menu, and this to restaurant menu. Now if menu equal null, then instead of restaurant loaded, we are going to emit a menu loaded and pass in the menu. Otherwise error state, and I'm just gonna say no menu found for this restaurant. So now we have all of our methods set up in our Cubit, and they are properly emitting the appropriate states. So in order for us to go ahead and test this, here we'll have to add some more methods to our fake restaurant API to allow testing. So we'll go to our fake restaurant API and we'll need to implement some of these methods. So for the find restaurant method, so for our find restaurant, I am going to add a filter, and this filter will be used if the search term is not null. So I am setting up this filter so that whenever we create our UI and we'll use this mock API to build our UI instead of going directly to the back end, we will use this filter and it will behave as if we are using the back end. So filter, so while the search term is not null, or if the search term is not null, then I am going to create a filter, and this filter will be a function. This function will accept a restaurant and will return the restaurant where restaurant name contains the search term. So that would be the filter. Otherwise, if it is null, then I'm going to set the filter to null. So I'm not going to use a filter in that case. Then I am just going to call return paginated restaurants, and I'm going to pass in the page, the size, and the filter. So let us see what's the error here. Future. So since it returns a future, I will have to make this a async method. So let us look at our paginated result. So it has a filter. So I should say filter equals filter. And that's it. We have already done our get all restaurants. For our get restaurants, it's pretty simple also for the get restaurant by ID. So what I'll do is I'll simply return this or list of restaurants, and I'm just gonna apply a where clause. So I'm gonna say return a single restaurant where, and now you can add a function for check where changes from element to restaurant. So I'm gonna say where restaurant dot ID is equal to the ID that is passed in. So that will return the restaurant that matches that ID. And if there's no match or else, so I'll use the or else here. So if there's no match, then I'll simply return null. So this is a simple where clause that checks if the restaurant exists, and if it doesn't, return null. Again, I'll have to make this an async method since it's returning a future. Get restaurant menu. I'm gonna leave this one for now. And get restaurant by location is pretty similar to find restaurant. So for our get restaurant by location, we're going to set up the same thing as the find restaurant, where we have a filter that is pretty much similar. So if the location is not null, then we are going to do the same thing where we pass in a restaurant to this filter, because this will be a function that is called, and we'll say that we want to check where the location of each restaurant is equal to the location that we pass in. Otherwise, return null for the filter. Then we'll simply return the paginated result or restaurant result with the page, the size, and the filter. And we'll just make this into an async method. So there we have it. But the thing about this now is that our filter as it stands wouldn't work because location is an object and we do not have object equality configured for our location since we did not override the operator. So we have to go back to our location class and we'll have to make this extends equatable. No, equatable is not installed here. So we'll have to find our package.yaml file for our restaurant. This one is for the app. We'll have to find our pubspec rather YAML for the restaurant module, and in that we will have to add, using the pubspec assist, to add equatable. So now that we have that, we save to compile. Close that window. Now back to our location, import. Now we have to add to the props all the properties of this location class. So in this case, we add a longitude and the latitude. We'll go ahead and do the same thing for the address. We'll make that equatable so we can compare address if needs be. We'll add the street, city, parish, and the zone. So now we've made this equatable. So now if we close this and back to our fake restaurant API, now the equality operator will work as it should when we are comparing restaurant location objects. So now that we have this set up, we can now go to our restaurant Cubit test and write a few more tests. So I'm just gonna go ahead and add another test, and this one is for get restaurant, since it's the only group that doesn't uses pagination. So get restaurant. All the other ones that use these paginations, the get all restaurant test should in a sense cover those. So I'm going to write my test, and the first test I want is that it returns restaurant when found. So here I am going to say SUT, in this case my Cubit, and I'm gonna call the get restaurant, and I'm just gonna pass it an ID of 1 since I know inside of my fake restaurant when I generated my list of restaurants, I use the index as the ID. So if I generated 100 restaurants, I know that the first ID will be 1 from that index. So I am inside my test, I am saying give me restaurant 1, and then I'm going to say await, expect later, to wait until the stream is completed, until the last value is emitted. And in this case, I'm gonna use the matcher, type matcher, and what I expect is that I have a state of restaurant loaded. So that is the state that I am expecting. Then after that, I will check, or I will cast the state since the state will be in its superclass form, which is restaurant state. I am going to cast it to restaurant loaded. Then I expect that the state restaurant, I expect that it is not null. I expect a restaurant to be present. So if I should go ahead and run this test, as you can see, my test is passing. So now for my next test, I will create a copy of this test, and I'll rename it to returns error when restaurant is not found. So I'm gonna pass in a value of -1 because I know there's no index or ID with -1. And inside my await later, I am expecting that this should be error state. and then I am going to cast this to error state. Then I'm expecting my state message. So there's an error message. I'm expecting that to not be null either. So if we go ahead and run the test now, then we see our test is passing. So now if we should go ahead and run all the tests, together to see if everything is passing as it should. Now we get all of our tests passing. And so guys, there we have it. We have configured our restaurant Cubit. We have configured a fake restaurant API to handle the request for now, since we haven't created our back end as yet. And so in the next video, we'll move on to create the actual UI and hook up the UI using this fake restaurant API so that we can have the app behaving as if it is connected to the backend. So in the next video, we'll begin to create that UI and to set up things. So thank you again for watching. See you in the next video, and remember, the code is always on GitHub so you can catch up. So see you in the next one, guys.